Of all the games that deserve like a remaster or a re-release, I think one of the top contenders has to be The Darkness. Developed by Starbreeze Studios way back in 2007 for the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, it's a first-person shooter based off the eponymous comic book series where you played as a badass mafia enforcer named Jackie Estacado, possessed by an ancient demonic force that's given him superpowers. And he's a pretty compelling character in a franchise that's been running for over 25 years at this point.
I guess I'm gonna have to tell you the truth about what kind of scumbag I really am.
It's also one of the most interesting games to ever get released for the 7th generation of consoles. Even more so I think because it never got ported to the PC, despite that being the case for its sequel, which we'll talk about soon enough. And I think it's just a byproduct of a game coming out during that time period where it was far more lucrative to develop games for the consoles over the PC, which is probably why we saw that version getting thrown to the wayside. Now, I do have a lot of mixed feelings about this thing, but I feel like every time I go back to replay it, I just keep finding something new that it does that really makes me think that it's a low-key masterpiece. But it's also a game that's definitely not getting better with age, which is really why I think a proper remaster or a port to the PC is becoming essential.
I'm gonna have fun either way.
A big reason too why so many people played and loved this thing was that it came out really early during the 7th generation consoles. So it was almost like people had to play it by default, especially if you wanted to play a first-person shooter on the PlayStation 3. However, I wouldn't recommend playing this on the PlayStation 3 because it's just a horrible port with one of the worst frame rates of all time. The Xbox 360 version was definitely the better one out of the bunch, and now luckily in 2021, if you've got the option, you can also play this thing optimized on the Xbox Series X, which is how I did it. This gives you decreased load times, but more importantly, better performance, and no, I'm not getting paid to say that. Either way though, it's been a while since I've talked about this thing, so I thought it might be worth hopping back into Estacado's boots once more and going on a mobster murdering spree.
I'm just here for the clean air and the engaging conversation.
Right, so the game opens as Jackie's en route to a mob hit with a couple of his mafia buddies for his boss, Paulie, in a vehicle sequence featuring one of the worst drivers you're ever going to see in a video game. I mean seriously, this guy ducks and weaves in and out of lanes more than Michael Schumacher. Things go from 0 to 60 pretty quickly though as the cops show up, and in the ensuing chase scene, the other two guys are killed, leaving Jackie to perform the hit all by himself. This opening sequence kinda serves as a basic tutorial, and for all of these early levels, you're still just your regular, everyday run-of-the-mill mafia enforcer. No superpowers, no ancient demonic entity whispering in your ear, none of that. It's just a straight-up first-person shooter. Turns out this hit was just a ruse though, and Paulie actually staged the whole thing to try to have Jackie killed. Because I'm sure the plan of trying to screw over someone who works for you, who also happens to be very good at murdering people, couldn't possibly go wrong, could it? Anyway, after gunning down a few waves of construction workers and thinning out organised crime in the city, Jackie's finally cornered in a public toilet with no way out. Yeah, been there before. At this point, the darkness takes over in one of the best sequences in the entire game, which you sadly have no control over. You see, a lot like the Kardashians, Jackie's got a bit of a cursed bloodline, where his family is somehow the host for this cosmic entity that's been around for like a bazillion years. And for some reason, this thing likes to pop the cherry of its host on their 21st birthday. And to think, all I got for my 21st was a new watch and a goddamn hip flask.
You are nothing but my puppet.
From this point on though, the darkness is sticking around for the ride.
Punish them.
With its voice in the back of Jackie's head constantly, like a cheese grater going up and down the back of his spine.
Darkness will fall.
The darkness is voiced by Mike Patton, who's putting so much effort into pulling this character off that I have to assume this guy did irreparable damage to his vocal cords.
More dead is better. Feed me with murder.
Either way though, he sounds awesome and he captures the tone perfectly, coming across as this evil murder-happy presence that's found its way into the head of a damaged mafia enforcer. About the only real problem with the writing here is that Jackie shows no reaction or even emotion to suddenly being taken over by this demonic presence. I mean look, if I started sprouting sentient demon arms that bit people's faces off, well, you can bet I'd have some kind of reaction to the whole thing. Here, it just seems to be like a minor nuisance that he mostly ignores.
Yeah, I'm sorry, baby. Things got kind of screwed up at work. I can't talk right now, but I'll be there soon. I promise.
From this point on though, it starts to affect the gameplay in some pretty big ways. For starters, you've got a pretty big visual difference. Both sides of the screen are taken up with these demon arms, which don't really do anything, and about all they're good for at this point is eating the hearts of your victims, which is going to slowly upgrade Jackie's darkness level. You now take slightly longer to be killed by gunfire though, as long as it's active, but to keep it active, you've got to shoot out every single light source, or else the darkness hides away faster than a pin dick in a cold shower. And look, he's gonna need all the help he can get here because old mate Paulie isn't too happy that he survived the ambush. So with the help of the family, Jackie's out to get revenge, trying to keep his girlfriend Jenny out of the firing line in the process. Yeah, let's see how that goes for him.
What are you talking about?
Now the story is broken down into individual missions, and then the world itself, set in New York City, is centered around a subway station which serves as a bit of a hub in between these main missions. And along with just being really detailed and populated with civilians, you can also interact with all these other characters to get all these side jobs. Like old mate Jimmy the Grape here, who looks like a combination of Freddy Krueger and someone's ballsack. This stuff doesn't really add anything new to the main game though, like you don't get any new gear or upgrades, and about all it earns you is some new collectibles, but it's still a really good way of adding some more believability to the game world. For all of its antiquated elements, this is still a strikingly believable environment, from the visuals through to the sound design, and it's always something that Starbreeze Studios have managed to nail in all of their games. From as far back as Chronicles of Riddick to as recently as when they splintered off into Machine Games and worked on the Wolfenstein series. For 2007 tech to be able to pull all of this stuff off is just a real testament to the talent that they had working for them at the time.
Hey, don't shoot me, son.
What's great about the Darkness too is that once the world opens up to you after that initial prologue, it really lets you explore it at your own pace, and there's a real sense of the game taking its time to get you engrossed in its world. As an example, the first time you meet Jenny at a new apartment, the two of you can just sit down and watch an entire film on TV. Yeah, someone just put an entire movie in there for no real reason other than just including that kind of attention to detail.
I can feel your heartbeat.
And there's like another 4 or 5 movies here you can watch in their entirety if you really want to. Another good example is how they actually made a fully 3D model of Jackie for when his darkness powers are active, even though the only time you'll ever really see this is if you happen to look in one of the game's few working mirrors. And again, like, not entirely necessary for a game that you spend 90% of the time playing from a first-person perspective, but it just really shows the kind of effort that's been put into this thing.
The fuck is that?
Not to mention, Jackie looks fucking terrifying in this form. I mean, I can see why all these bad guys are so scared of him. He makes Batman look like Barney the dinosaur in comparison. When it comes to the shooting, well, this is where it comes back to what I said before, right? How this thing hasn't really aged all that gracefully. The Darkness is not a fantastic shooter. In fact, when it comes to that side of things, it's just kind of average at best. And if you're playing on the PlayStation 3, because of the really bad frame rate, I'd say it's often terrible. Now, over the years, I've finished this thing on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. Now, more recently with the Xbox Series X. And I gotta say, man, that the PlayStation 3 version is the worst one by far. It's better on the Xbox 360 and then miles better on the Series X, but either way, you're gonna come to realize very quickly that this is a game you're playing for the story and the characters, and that's the main thing that's gonna keep you moving forward. Because what happens to someone pretty early on in the game here has to be one of the most traumatic scenes in all of gaming. And if this sequence doesn't motivate you to seek out vengeance, well then absolutely nothing will. People who played it are going to know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not implied, it's not downplayed, it's just raw and matter of fact, and it's pretty damn intense. And it kind of highlights my main issue with the Darkness, and that's how the story, the writing, and the overall atmosphere is always at odds with the gameplay. And I think a better example of this are the levels set inside that World War I inspired nightmare world.
You should not be.
Right, so throughout the story, whenever Jackie is seriously injured to the point that any normal person would have been killed, the Darkness kind of locks him away inside what's essentially a mental prison while it gets to repairing his body. Here, it's a World War I inspired no man's land, where he fights against ghoulish looking soldiers wearing German military outfits, and has to move through trenches and across these vast empty battlefields. There's a really talented Polish artist named Zdzisław Beksinski, I'm sure I mispronounced that, and I'm pretty damn sure that this guy is a huge influence on the kind of things you're going to see in these levels. I mean, take one look at that guy's paintings, then take a look at some of the areas in the Darkness.
I'll tear your mind. I'll boil your eyes.
And these are visually stunning environments. They're horrific, they're frightening, and they're surreal. The perfect backdrop for the mental projection of Jackie as he's trapped inside this hellish limbo. But then on the flip side, they just go on for far too long. You only fight the same looking enemies over and over, and it's this repetitive loop of shooting them, then eating their hearts with the demon arms to stop them from reanimating. So at the forefront of all these levels, which are downright artistic at times and really interesting from a storytelling perspective, is just the feeling of them also being kinda boring and needlessly long. These levels though are kind of important because while he's in there, Jackie finds and interacts with his great-grandfather Anthony, who goes into the reasoning and the history behind the darkness and why it's cursed their family.
Don't you see it? Everything happened here, Jackie. This is where it all began.
But then it's all kind of juxtaposed with stuff like this, where you're on the back of a tank firing a machine gun that never runs out of ammo. And then again later on, emptying a couple of hundred rounds of this thing into the mouth of a ghetto shambler that just never fucking dies. I think another issue here too is that you're not really playing a traditional first-person shooter, you're playing a third-person shooter from a first-person perspective. It's the same thing these guys did back in the Chronicles of Riddick games. You're not just moving a camera around at head height, you're moving a person around with legs, arms, and a torso. And it's not until you play this thing for yourself you're going to realize just how clunky the movement and the shooting can really be, compared to pretty much every single other first-person shooter, where you're really just a floating set of arms with a gun. I mean, go play Half-Life, Quake, or Doom Eternal. You look down and what do you see? Nothing. Which is also what happens when you look down at your wang when you're taking a piss, you little pin dick. The darkness, on the other hand, is trying to replicate the movements of someone who has to turn and move around with the handicap of an actual body. And this means that the animation has to compensate for these sudden and erratic movements that wouldn't be an issue in any other shooter. Also, something like walking too close to a wall has Jackie raise his weapon upwards. It's not just going to magically clip to the wall itself. Credit where credit is due, for the animation side of things, this kind of stuff just must be a monumental task to carry out and implement. But as a result, it does mean that the movement and the shooting controls can often feel like shit, cold shit in fact. There's all these options in the menu like acceleration, the sensitivities for the X or Y axis, but it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And you're either going to get the hang of it at some point, or just crash and burn horribly in a fiery wreck.
Let him get away!
There's a huge focus on dual wielding here. Jackie can carry a bunch of different pistols in his left and right hand along with dual SMGs. What I think is kind of neat too is how you can also reload each hand individually, which means if you alternate between firing with the left and right when the opposite hand is reloading, you can in theory almost keep firing uninterrupted as long as you got ammo. Get up nice and close to someone and you can perform a series of executions to kill them in a single hit. And these really show off how cold and efficient Jackie is as a hitman.
Break yourself, fool!
But the shooting is still often very underwhelming. There's a ludicrous amount of spread when firing the SMGs, for instance, and you get bugger all ammo for these to the point that you're constantly having to swap out to something else. The assault rifles are pretty good, but they don't show up until later in the game, and the shotguns are useless at anything but point-blank range. In fact, there's a sequence early on in the game when you're ambushed by the cops in a restaurant, and if you run out of pistol ammo before clearing out the cops at the far end of the street, well, I don't think it's even possible to close that gap without getting gunned down like a little bitch. It's also got a really temperamental auto-aim system that works about 50% of the time. Sometimes it's going to snap onto someone on the other side of the street. Then other times, someone's standing right in front of you and it's like they're John Cena. Get it? Because you can't see him. The enemy certainly has no trouble hitting you though. I mean, check out this guy, right? Hiding behind a dumpster on the other side of the street. Blind firing around the side and still somehow being able to hit me through this window. Yeah, okay, bro. It's not really a case of the game just being old. I mean, there's plenty of 360 and PS3 games from that era that still control smoothly. The darkness just isn't one of them.
You're fucking hilarious.
Enemies often seem to frequently survive the kind of bullet barrage that would obliterate a normal human being, and then just get right on back up as if they just slipped on a banana peel. I mean, look at this guy. He gets back up after catching half a magazine from my SMG. I mean, does that look like the kind of injury that someone survives? Come on now. A big part of the gameplay is using the darkness to assist in combat, but the darkness only works in, well, the darkness. So you're going to spend a fair bit of time shooting out all these nearby light sources. And it probably would have been fine with a mouse and a keyboard, because aiming upwards at a street lamp, shooting it out, and then readjusting your aim to shoot back at enemies won't be an issue. But trying to do that with a controller just really takes the jam out of your jelly donut. It doesn't help either that Jackie gets dropped like a bag of shit in this game. Even with the darkness active, you just die so quickly, and it often makes the darkness feel more visual than functional.
Don't let him get away!
At least until you start unlocking some of the abilities. The first one you'll get is the Creeping Darkness. Now this sends out the right arm off by itself, which is primarily used all of a couple of times to open locked doors, but can also be used to take out enemies from a distance. It's not entirely necessary, but it is pretty cool. The next one is the Demon Arm, which is supposed to be able to kill enemies, but I don't think I've ever been able to get a single kill with it. And it's used mostly for moving physics objects that are blocking your way forward. Thirdly, you've got the Darkness Guns, 2 sidearms with infinite ammo that use up darkness energy. And I think this is the game's way of trying to compensate for the otherwise lack of ammunition. And these guns are pretty cool. The only problem is that you can't use them in conjunction with the other abilities. It's got to be one at a time, which is kind of stupid. And then finally, you've got the Black Hole, which, along with sucking enemies into this destructive vortex, also sucks away any kind of balancing the game might have ever had. You see, once this thing shows up, it renders every single gunfight obsolete and removes any kind of challenge whatsoever. Yeah, you throw out one of these things and it sucks in all the nearby bad guys and kills them instantly. Those times when you're ambushed by a car full of enemies, well, pop out that black hole in the middle of the bunch and watch as they all get thrown around like wet laundry in a tumble dryer. You almost feel sorry for them. Being able to spawn in your own little darklings is a pretty cool feature too. You've got a melee guy, a gunner, a kamikaze, and a light killer who goes around zapping light sources. And they're pretty cute in an ugly, horrific, not cute at all sort of way. And they also have a lot of character.
Every man for himself!
Despite being these 2-foot tall little gremlins that don't do much more than just make for good fodder. Seeing the Berserker Darkling, for instance, beelining towards someone, and then just hopping onto their shoulders and stabbing them in the face really never does get old. It's like a murderous demonic pug or something. But I can't help feel that despite all of these powers, the best sequences in the game are the ones that are scripted that you have no control over. The final level of the game, where Jackie attacks a lighthouse full of mafia guys, is one of the most badass things you're ever going to see in a video game. Guys are getting stabbed through the chest, they're thrown all around the rooms, while the nearby darklings crawl across the walls like spiders. Jackie's terrorizing these guys so much that they're praying for mercy, and you really do start to feel sorry for them. At one point, he even uses one of his demon arms to knock a chopper right out of the sky. And it just makes it even more disappointing when you realize you can't really do any of that during actual gameplay. To upgrade the darkness, you've got to eat hearts, and this is as simple as just pressing the A button on a nearby corpse. But even if you manage to level this thing up to the max, at which case you'd have seriously high cholesterol, nothing's gonna come close to the sheer mayhem Jackie causes in those scripted sequences. And again, it all just comes back to what I've been saying, which is how the writing here really trumps the gameplay.
I grow strong.
Having said that though, the darkness does have its moments of pure catharsis. You get to kill all the people you want to kill, and everything does get wrapped up in a neat little package. There's a really sad little epilogue between Jackie and Jenny, which is a bittersweet ending for these two main characters who are really a victim of circumstance. And it's really one of the few times where I'm able to overlook the majority of things the game does poorly, simply because of the multitude of things it does well. There's a reason why so many people look back on this thing fondly, in the same way that I look back fondly on Susanna Hoff in the Walk Like an Egyptian music video. Now, it wasn't until 2012 that we got a sequel, and to make it even more interesting, the sequel wasn't developed by Starbreeze. Instead, it was Digital Extremes who completely changed the way the game looked, along with replacing the voice actor for Jackie with Brian Bloom. Yeah, big bad terror Billy himself.
Every second of every day for the last 2 fucking years, I kept myself in check.
Which is kind of a coincidence when you consider that Starbreeze Studios would go on to become Machine Games, and then they'd use the guy years later when they worked on the Wolfenstein games.
Are you listening to me?
Yeah, I got it.
Anyway, I remember when this thing first came out and people absolutely shit all over it. The problem is that it was a follow-up to something which by that point had a really devoted cult following. Now you've got a new developer coming in, swinging their dicks around and changing the way the whole thing looks, and replacing the voice for the main character.
Oh, hey, hiya, Jackie. Those are some nice shoes. Are those Belutis?
The story is set 2 years after the events in the first game, after the death of Paulie, where Jackie's now become the head of the family.
It's about fucking time.
The game even opens with a really cool Goodfellas style sequence as you walk through a fancy restaurant.
Hey yo, Paulie, I got you them tickets to the game. My treat.
Eventually sitting down at a table with a couple of ladies of the night, who both look like they could suck the chrome off a tow bar.
Hi, Jackie. Remember us from the Candy Club?
And again, like the first game's prologue, it doesn't take too long before things kick off, as the entire place turns into a goddamn war zone. Jackie's under attack by a mysterious cult trying to harness the power of the darkness for themselves. And after suffering from some pretty serious wounds, he's got no choice but to re-embrace it just simply to survive.
My friend!
Oh! What the hell is that?
Like the first game, there's a big focus on the story and the dialogue with heavy scenes of exposition that highlight just how different a voice actor Brian Bloom is.
What the fuck did you do? I needed him! I needed answers!
Yeah. I'm fine. Just kinda tired.
You motherfuckers are gonna pay!
Contrary to what a lot of people seem to say, I don't think this guy is bad. In fact, I think he works pretty well within the script. He sounds exactly what I'd expect a PTSD-suffering mafia boss to sound like.
I know.
He talks the way you'd expect to his friends, and he talks the way you'd expect to his enemies.
Nice.
Throughout the game too, he actually converses to the darkness, interacting with it and even arguing with it at times.
I'm done being a puppet.
Compared to the first game again, where I don't think Jackie acknowledged it a single time. In the darkness too, despite all the other crap going on, Jackie's also trying to deal with Jenny being gone, seeing her in visions throughout the game, some of which are actually kind of painful to sit through, really emphasizing this guy's remorse. One of the flashbacks inside a diner, honestly, almost brought me to tears the first time.
Jenny?
Damn it.
Instead of those World War I style interludes whenever Jackie's seriously injured, now it's all set inside an asylum. With a One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest vibe as all the king's horses and all the king's men try to put Jackie back together again.
We're working on a plan to escape this place disguised as a band-aid.
Yeah, but we're not sure if we can pull it off.
The real new highlight of the game though is the Darkling.
Hello, monkey. It's been too long. Give us a hug.
You see, instead of the first game where you'd spawn these guys in at random, now there's only one of them hanging out with you pretty much the entire time, and this guy is an absolute little champion. He's one of the most adorable characters of all time and incredibly endearing.
What is that? Some kind of monster?
You even get to play as him for a couple of sequences.
Close enough for you?
Overall, it's a pretty good story. It's dark and it's gritty. And once again, Jackie gets put through the absolute ringer. One point he's locked into a goddamn Iron Maiden, which is about as metal as it gets. I always thought it was kind of weird how people say they preferred the original game's art style when that game to me just looked like any mid-2000s game engine. And I think that someone who looks at an environment like this, for instance, or goes through any of these hellish landscapes and somehow still clings to the notion that this isn't a good looking game, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but you just may be a fucking imbecile.
I know.
This really just looks like a comic book come to life, with cel-shaded visuals and Jackie looking way closer to his comic book counterpart. There's better facial animation too during those intermission screens when Jackie gives a bit of a brief monologue. Like this time, Jackie's face actually moves, as opposed to looking like he'd OD'd on Botox injections. The biggest complaint you heard about the sequel though was the lack of the city area as a hub. In the first game, you'd go back and forth between different sections of New York, you could talk to random NPCs and get side missions. And that's about the only complaint that I can agree with. It definitely does feel a lot more linear.
Hey, don't I know you?
I don't think so, Chief.
In between missions, you're back at Jackie's apartment and you can talk to all your mobster buddies, but there's really nothing of value here. Just kind of feels like a speed hump in between killing people.
Let us know when you're ready to go and kick some righteous ass.
Outside of how you feel about the story, the writing and the visuals and all that kind of stuff, which really just is subjective, I do think though that the combat loop is what's been massively overhauled for the better. For starters, it doesn't control like shit, and moving and aiming actually feels like a proper first-person shooter, thank God. There is a weapon limit though, which is a bit of a shame. You can carry 2 small weapons like pistols or SMGs, as well as a heavier weapon like an assault rifle. You can't individually reload each weapon when dual wielding like you could in the first game, but that's really only I think the downgrade the combat has. Everything else to me feels vastly improved. I mean, the darkness now feels like an actual superpower, and the demon arms have actual functions outside of just being a cool looking border around the edges of the screen. You can pick up objects and hurl them at enemies. Pick up spikes or metal poles and you'll impale someone, boxes or garbage bins and you'll bludgeon them to death, or air conditioner fans and you'll slice them in half. You can rip off car doors and use them as a bullet shield, then throw them at someone and slice them in half. Enemies can be either killed or even just stunned with the demon arms too, and there's different attacks depending on the direction you swipe. Swipe up for instance and they'll float in the air for a couple of seconds, making them easy pickings. When an enemy is stunned, you can grab them with the demon arm and even perform different executions. There's even ones to get back health and ammo, so you can kinda control your own resources, which is a really awesome idea. I mean, it's not quite on the same level as a recent example like Doom Eternal, but it does help to deal with the otherwise complete lack of ammo or health items. Some of these executions are also really graphic, man, like picking someone up and slicing them in half right down the middle.
Please, Mary, Mother of God!
About the only issue with this on the PC is that controlling the demon arm is done by using the middle mouse button, and that can kind of feel clunky at times. But it's still a really creative way to incorporate the demon arms into combat and make them more than just a cosmetic addition. What I really like about this too is the new abilities you've got as well, gun channeling and swarm. Gun channeling increases your weapon damage and swarm can distract enemies with a cloud of insects. There's even an execution to quicken the cooldown time for both of these. Even better than that, eating hearts is now pretty much instant, and the only way to properly regain your health points, removing that annoying unskippable animation from the first game. And then in lieu of the black hole ability, enemies are often going to leave behind black holes instead of hearts as random power-ups, which I gotta say is probably for the best considering that thing was just absolutely broken in the first game. It is still really overpowered though, and it can clear out a group of people faster than a curry fart in a phone booth. But the fact that it's randomized now means you won't just rely on spamming it every single time that's possible. Even just the minor thing of there being far less light sources to have to shoot out. To me, it's just a much smoother and a more developed combat system that feels incredibly rewarding when the whole thing clicks. And hearing those enemies scream in terror at the mere sight of you, it really amps up the power fantasy element. You even get these cool slow motion shots sometimes when you finish off that final enemy. It's awesome. With every kill you make, you earn essence, which can then be spent buying you upgrades for Jackie, and you won't even come close to unlocking all of this on your first playthrough. Which is kinda good too, because it encourages replayability with the New Game Plus mode, which is also doubly good because of how goddamn short the whole thing is. It's probably another good complaint to make here. I mean, I think the first game probably took me 15 hours to finish. I beat the second game though for the first time in around 5. These upgrades can also make some pretty big differences to the combat. I mean, gun channeling for instance can be upgraded so that it auto-locks onto enemies when you're dual wielding. And swarm can be upgraded to target multiple enemies at once to stun them for even longer. Once you've unlocked all of this stuff, you just become an absolute force of nature, sending out a swarm of bugs on someone like it's your own pocket version of the 10 Plagues. They've even included the demon armor this time, which was one of Jackie's powers from the comics, which reduces the amount of damage you take. There's also some really cathartic moments in this campaign too. I think that opening level when you finally get your powers back and can get vengeance on all these bad guys who attacked you is really rewarding. It's like finally being able to scratch an itch between your toes. Later on in the game, you move through a brothel and you see this montage of all these women being abused by all these patrons. You've got to walk past all these scumbags who work there who are all giving you the evil eye. But then a few minutes later, you let off your leash and can go back through and rip these pieces of shit apart. And a horrid boss fight against an absolute prick of an antagonist ends with you performing open heart surgery on the guy by ripping his ribcage open with the demon arms and then pulling out his still beating heart and crushing it in your hands. You even get extra upgrade points for it. Yeah, thanks for the points, idiot. So the Darkness 2 really knows how to release those endorphins and indulge the player's sadistic fantasies, and it's a lot of fun. That is, until you get towards the end of the game. And I say that because the last third or so of this game, it goes from being this really fun power fantasy to suddenly being a really annoying slog against these really annoying enemies that belong to this cult. These guys are all using siphoned off darkness energy in the form of armor and weapons, and they take a bit more finessing to remove their souls from their body and their heads and arms from their torso. You've got to fight these heavily armored guys, pretty typical. There's enemies that steal your gun with a lasso, and then there's a guy with a shield that has to be battered down and the shield ripped out of his hands. Oh, and the worst ones are the guys with these giant spotlights on their shoulders, because when they're shining these things in your eyes, you can't pinpoint the right spot to shoot out the light. And they all share one thing in common in that they're just a complete nuisance. I always end up just spamming the cheesiest abilities to try to clear them out, and experimentation isn't really all that effective, especially on hard mode. I also kind of found that around this point in the game, ammo just seemed to be non-existent, and I always had barely anything to get by. Trying to look around for a new gun to swap out to in the middle of combat's like trying to spot pocket change in the middle of a kickboxing match. Yeah, not a good idea.
This is hell.
Okay, that's a new one.
To coincide with the events in the campaign is the co-op missions in the Vendetta mode. Now this is pretty cool. This is a 4-player mode that lasts about an hour or so, where you can play as one of 4 different characters, all who have their own unique darkness artifact and one of the powers from the main game. Like there's a samurai dude who can cast Swarm for instance, and a voodoo doctor who can use the black hole. This is a bit of a free-for-all mode too, where you try to kill the enemies as quickly as possible to farm essence, because this mode also has its own upgrade trees for each separate character. But it's not really been implemented in the best way, and unless you're all willing to share kills, well, someone's not going to be upgrading themselves as much as someone else. It also definitely feels like it's been balanced for multiple players. The enemy count is pretty damn high, and the lack of survivability options for these characters compared to Jackie means you get shredded really quickly. The main way to heal yourself is through executions and taking hearts from your victims, and it does become a bit of a bum rush to get to these before the other players. A lot of the time I just found myself spamming the execution button just to stay on my goddamn feet. It's also got an odd amount of indestructible light sources, which is annoying but also disorienting, where you find yourself blinded by a giant spotlight that you can't even shoot out. Aside from some banter between the playable characters, the whole thing's pretty damn forgettable. It does make a good side piece to the main story, and your objectives actually directly relate to the major plot points in the main game, which is a nice touch. But it's also reusing a lot of the same environments, and it clearly hasn't had as much work put into it. Still though, stabbing dudes in the heart with a katana or watching them get sucked into a black hole isn't the worst way to spend an evening with the boys. The Darkness 2 ends on probably one of the biggest cliffhangers of all time, especially for gaming, and doubly especially for a first-person shooter. In fact, the ending to 13 is the only thing I can think of that comes close to leaving us with such blue balls, compared to the ending for the first game, which really felt like it had everything resolved. The other thing that's left unresolved is the first game coming to PC, and look, I know I can't be the only one pining to replay this in its ideal format. What I think we really need to do here is just tweet about it. Tweet to Digital Extremes or 2K Games or whoever's got the rights to this thing and kind of demand a PC port. At a time when gaming's probably at an all-time high in terms of the development costs, I'd think that remastering an old classic like this for the PC and selling it to the hardcore nostalgic fan base as well as bringing in a new audience would be a win-win. The gaming companies get to make all their money, and we get to experience an updated and improved version of the game. And considering how depressing 2021's been so far, we'd take all the wins we can get.